Bromwich.
Okay, great. And if people could resume their seats. We have had an absolutely fantastic day. In planning this, I got more and more excited as more and more amazing speakers came on. And I have to say, today's flow has been absolutely wonderful. So I know it's been a long day, so I want to introduce our final keynote speaker, Michael Bromwich. On June 29th, in the midst of a very bad economy, when lots of people were looking for jobs, I can tell you there was probably one job that nobody wanted, and that was to come in as the new head of what was the Minerals Management Service. That wasn't a job that I would have wanted to take, and I can think of very few people who would want to take it. I have to say that in another life, Michael probably would have been a firefighter because that's what he's been doing. And as I've been preparing myself for this introduction, it actually turns out that in some ways, I think Michael is a firefighter. He's an organizational firefighter. For the last 10 years, 12 years, from the private sector, he has been running investigations into troubled organizations, often private companies, sometimes public organizations. For 6 years, he was an independent monitor for the DC Metropolitan Police Department, which had lots of problems and needed to reform. He came in as the independent outside person to work with them on that. He, in 2009, took on a similar role for the Virgin Islands police force, which I don't know if the problems were any worse, but certainly the location can be very nice. He has done that in Houston. He has done that kind of job in many locations, which is why it seemed illogical that he was tapped. And I guess he must have a real strong constitution for jumping into, if not burning houses, burning organizations and set them straight. And so he's been given that role. Now this morning, at this podium, Secretary of Interior Ken Salazar announced that the organization that Michael has come in to reform and is working on is going to be divided into two. And he made a number of other announcements, and so I see the press wires are flying hot and heavy right now. And so all I can say is I knew it was going to be a great speech long before this morning, but this morning, the moment I heard the word announcement, I thought, well, this is going to be great. So on that note, I'm going to turn the podium over to Michael. We will be doing questions on note cards at all. They'll come back to me. I will filter through, and whatever time we have after his remarks, I will ask questions of Michael, your questions for Michael, and then we can all relax in the reception area. Sounds good. Thank you. Michael.
Thank you very much, Peter. I appreciate it. Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this very important conference on our changing oceans. It's a privilege to be here. This would be an important subject at any time, but it is especially important at a time when we are making critical decisions about the future of offshore energy development in the United States. I know that you've had a long and no doubt exciting day, and it's actually a daunting task to be your final speaker today because I know that some of you are eager to go to the reception that Peter just mentioned. But I know that earlier this morning you heard from the co-chairs of the National Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill and offshore drilling, as well as from Interior Secretary Ken Salazar. I was here during Secretary Salazar's remarks. Now, in my remarks this afternoon, I want to discuss the steps that my agency is taking to renew its commitment to the responsible stewardship of our nation's resources on the Outer Continental Shelf, and importantly, to rebalance our decision-making processes with a renewed emphasis on acquiring and analyzing scientific information. The Deepwater Horizon tragedy has shaken government and, I hope, industry out of a complacency and overconfidence that had developed over the past several decades. That complacency and overconfidence created a situation in which the increased dangers of deepwater drilling were not matched by increased vigilance and concern for the safety of those operations. We are in the process of making profound changes in the manner in which oil and gas drilling and development in the waters off our country's shores is done. These changes are long overdue, and is, as so often the case when it comes to serious reform anywhere, in any business, in any endeavor, they're being spurred by a catastrophe. The unprecedented deepwater blowout of the Macondo well, the explosion and sinking of the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig, the tragic deaths of 11 workers, and a spill of nearly 5 million barrels of oil into the waters of the Gulf of Mexico. This week marks my 7th month as the Director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management Regulation and Enforcement. As you know, Secretary Salazar created the agency after the Deepwater Horizon accident to replace the former Minerals Management Service. Now, the mandate I received from President Obama and Secretary Salazar was both ambitious and urgent to reform offshore energy development, starting with the agency responsible for overseeing it. One second. It's a problem when you use a teleprompter and then it dies on you. Since that time, we've been working aggressively to make the changes necessary to restore the public's confidence that offshore oil and gas drilling and production are being conducted safely and with appropriate protections for marine and coastal environments. This topic is obviously nothing if not timely. I know you heard this morning, as I mentioned before, from the distinguished co-chairs of the Commission, Bill Riley and Bob Graham. The Commission's report is a thoughtful and comprehensive analysis of not only the spill itself, but of the history and development of offshore drilling and of the regulation of offshore drilling. I want to commend the Commission and its staff for their hard work, their professionalism, and their willingness to listen to and to take into account our perspectives on the issues they were examining. I encourage each of you, if you haven't already done so, to read the report. We will continue to review and analyze the report's recommendations. As the Commission describes in its report, regulatory and industry reform after a significant offshore disaster has happened before. The United Kingdom and Norway substantially changed their oversight of offshore drilling and production following the Piper Alpha and the Alexander Keeland incidents. Australia is currently facing many of the same issues we are confronting because of the Montara blowout, which occurred only 8 months before Deepwater Horizon. The specific challenges facing us, however, are unique in many significant respects. The scale of the offshore oil and gas operations in U.S. waters, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico, is vastly greater than those in the North Sea. The economies of many of the Gulf Coast states, particularly Louisiana, are closely tied to offshore industry to an extent that is not fully appreciated around the country. The Gulf accounts for more than 25% of domestic oil production and approximately 12% of domestic gas production. One of the key problems that we are addressing and that cannot be avoided is this: how will government and industry make the fundamental reforms necessary to improve the safety and environmental protection in this massive industry, while at the same time allowing operations to continue? To illustrate the problem, consider this. UK offshore production, which again is at a much smaller scale than that in the Gulf, dropped off very substantially for 2 full years following the Piper Alpha incident. Now, the major challenge facing us and the industry is to dramatically improve the safety of drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, particularly in deep water, while continuing with operations, keeping production flowing and keeping people working. While the Commission has been doing its work, we at BOMR have been busy seeking to address many of the issues identified by the Commission. Let me be specific about what we've already done and what we plan to do in the future. Together with Secretary Salazar, we have undertaken the most aggressive and comprehensive reform of offshore oil and gas regulation and oversight in U.S. history. This includes the reorganization of the former MMS to establish mission clarity and to strengthen oversight. And it also includes the development and implementation of heightened standards for drilling practices, safety equipment, and environmental safeguards. These new rules set forth prescriptive standards that industry must meet, but they also establish for the first time in the U.S. offshore regulatory system performance-based standards focused on the identification and mitigation of specific risks associated with offshore operations. These changes are substantial, and more work is being done to ensure that these changes are both lasting and effective. The ultimate goal is to establish an industry-wide culture of safety and to have well-equipped and professional regulators. Both elements are necessary to keep pace with the challenges and risks of offshore drilling. That is especially important as those operations push into new frontiers and face increased technical challenges. Now, earlier today, as Peter mentioned, Secretary Salazar and I announced the details of our reorganization. As most of you know, the Secretary initially outlined the guiding idea behind the plan as long ago as May of 2010. And that was the creation of 3 strong independent agencies with clearly defined roles and missions. MMS had conflicting missions of promoting resource development, enforcing safety regulations, and maximizing revenues from offshore operations. Those conflicts and the agency's chronic lack of resources led to its inability to effectively meet all of the challenges of overseeing companies in the offshore industry operating in U.S. waters. The reorganization of the former MMS is designed to remove those conflicts. It does so by clarifying and separating missions across 3 agencies and providing each of the new agencies with clear missions and the organizational and human resources necessary to fulfill those missions. Now, we are designing and implementing these organizational changes while we fully take into account the crucial need for information sharing and the other links between the functions of the former MMS. This is essential to ensure that regulatory processes that are related to offshore leasing, plan approval, and permitting do not become bogged down and cause unacceptable delays. On October 1 of last year, the revenue collection arm of the former MMS became the Office of Natural Resources Revenue and now is located in a different part of the Interior Department with a reporting structure and chain of command completely separate from the offshore regulator. The President's Commission agrees fully with this change. Over the coming months, the offshore resource management and enforcement programs will be established as separate independent organizations. That's what we announced earlier today. These next steps in the reorganization are more difficult, but also extremely important. They involve separating the energy development functions from the safety and environmental enforcement missions of the nation's offshore regulator. The Interior Department, as well as the President's Commission, has concluded that the separation of these missions is essential to reforming the government's oversight of energy development in our country's oceans. Now, I want to share with you some of the details of what those 2 new independent agencies, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM, and the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, BSEE or BSEE, will look like and what their distinct missions will be. Because this reorganization is more than just moving boxes around on an organization chart. It's about making fundamental and carefully considered changes in the way these agencies operate. The new